And Eugene, looks like you're on mute. Well, we may be having a little bit of trouble getting Eugene on. I'll cover his slides, but Eugene, if you're able to make it work, feel free to jump in. So the area plan, which was passed by City Council in 2019, was a general plan for the far northeast area, the Montbello community, Green Valley Ranch, Gateway, and DIA that looked at all issues in the neighborhood, in these neighborhoods, including transportation. The plan envisions creating a connected street network throughout this area and ensuring a high quality experience for users of every transportation mode. So people walking, biking, taking transit, etc.
Hello.
Oh, you're on, Eugene. Hey, Eugene.
So, sorry, I had a little bit of trouble logging in. Is this my go to welcome everyone and talk about Connect?
Yes.
So great. Hello, everyone. Glad to join you. Finally got logged in here, but I wanted to just really say that this is a great opportunity. We are really excited to be a part of this open house and to see how many of you who participated in the Far Northeast Area Plan can really truly see how plans continue to work and advance your priorities as a community. The Far Northeast Area Plan that I had the privilege of working with many of you on several, about 2-3 years ago for a couple of years, really laid the foundation for a lot of the city investments and infrastructure and community desired goals and objectives that you all are beginning to see materialize in your communities. So really working with you all, working with a key stakeholder group, members of your community, many of you who have lived in the neighborhood for several generations, in hearing and learning and growing from you all and understanding really truly how you imagine your communities, your 3 neighborhoods evolving and growing over the next 10 to 15 to 20 years really was the foundation for the Far Northeast Area Plan and really helped us as a city truly understand your community, your individual neighbors, and all of you in such a meaningful way so that we could develop a plan that represented your dreams and wishes and aspirations. And now we're getting to see some of the investments in the community desired goals and projects come to life. So really, hopefully you all will get excited about the projects that are going to be discussed this evening, some of the work that continues to grow and evolve with your input and your guidance. And really just am excited to see how not only the grocery stores and some of the flooding issues being resolved and addressed, how we continue to see even more work really truly create the community that you all have set out as your vision for your future. I can go on, but I'll stop there for the sake of time. And know that if you all have any questions, feel free to reach out to myself or Paige, and we'll be more than happy to address any questions that come up this evening. So thank you.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Eugene. Okay, you can skip this slide as well. Thank you. Okay, so thanks so much, Eugene. He did a much better job at that than I was attempting to do. So I am the project manager. I'm Paige Colton for the Far Northeast Next Step study. So that's, as Eugene had mentioned, a initiative by the Denver Department of Transportation and Infrastructure. So dealing with all mobility and infrastructure issues, an implementation plan to move all of the great transportation ideas that came out of the area plan. So I'm just going to walk through briefly what this plan, what this next step study will look like, and then we'll get into some fun polling exercises. So our first step, and something we've already started, is to evaluate the proposed transportation networks that came out of the area plan. split the recommendations that came out of the area plan into distinct logical projects. So, you know, maybe a concern was, wow, Montbello has a lot of speeding. So how do we break that into individual projects that we can actually deliver on? It's evaluating, essentially, are these feasible projects? And then further detailing out what these projects might end up looking like. We're then going to score and prioritize these projects. So there are a lot of projects, over 100 that came out of the area plan. Which should we look at doing first? Which are a high priority for the community? Which can we get funding for within our department? These are all questions we're going to be asking ourselves. We'll be developing project cost estimates and implementation plans for each of these projects. And then we'll advance the highest priority projects into concept design. So the idea is, okay, so we have a certain number of really high priority projects. How do we make those happen faster to ensure that you all see projects in the ground sooner? Okay, next slide. So these are just some maps of all the different transportation, we call them modal networks, essentially how people get around in different ways that came out of the area plan, and we've made some additions as well. So the lines are where we're hoping to improve conditions for that type of movement. And then the dots are intersections or trail connections where we think improvements should be made as well. And this is just a map of the pedestrian improvement projects. Next slide. The bicycle projects, and definitely a lot was added in the area plan for improving that bike connection network all across this area. Next slide. Transit projects and making sure that the whole area is connected via bus and to the train stations that already exist, and then to the rest of the city. Next slide. And then also thinking about where our freight traffic goes. So it's a big thing that came out of the area plan is that we should be designating corridors for freight traffic so they aren't using local or collector streets in the neighborhood. And how can we both designate those corridors and also improve intersections where there might be a lot of freight traffic? Okay, so this diagram really just goes over, again, what I already covered. A couple items to highlight in green, we have community actions, or where we're looking for your input. Right now, we are working on prioritizing projects, and we want your input on how exactly to prioritize those. And then we'll also run kind of the full list of projects and our draft plan by you as well later on this year. Next slide. Okay, so prioritizing projects. There are lots of different ways to prioritize projects. The evaluation criteria on the left is items that we think are important to you all in the community, and we want to confirm with you that that's correct. I'll walk through these. And then the ones on the right, the implementation criteria, those are criteria that we use internally with NDOTI to understand, can we get funding for these projects? How constructible are they? Are they easy to build? Are they harder to build? Can we package them with other projects? And that'll also help determine the timeline of when we build out these projects, is how internally we can implement them. So just walking through the evaluation criteria briefly, which is intended to reflect your priorities. So growth pressure is intended to prioritize projects in areas that the area plan identified as being regional centers, community centers, that sort of thing. Safety is intended to prioritize projects that improve, obviously, safety on our roads, especially on corridors that we consider especially dangerous in the city. Transportation equity is intended to make sure projects happen in neighborhoods or areas with lower income folks, areas with higher elderly residents or a number of children, that sort of thing. Climate change and resiliency. We've got a couple concepts about addressing the heat island effect. So is there good tree canopy in this area? Will this project help address that? And then also, how well do projects improve multimodal movement? So how well does a project improve things for people walking, biking, or taking transit? And then lastly, access to destinations. Will a project get you to the school or grocery store or park? Should we be using that as a priority or a criteria to evaluate our projects? Okay, so I know that was a lot of information, but I'm going to move us into a more fun activity, which is Mentimeter. So if you could go to this website, either on your phone or on the computer, it's www.menti.com. And Katie, maybe you could put this information in the, oh, Dana's already in on it. And then use the code 9530-3537. We're also putting that in the chat as well.
And while we're taking time to do this, we'd also like to give a special thank you to Council District 11 and 8 for being in attendance. So thank you for participating in the meeting. So we'll give you all some time to fill this out. Looks like we're getting some votes in. 7 of us have voted so far. Looks like safety is coming in at number 1 with transportation equity following it. That's interesting. And then access to destinations, climate change and resiliency. And then last but not least is growth pressure. So I'll continue to give you guys a couple more minutes or a minute or two to fill this out.
And I will just chime in here very quickly that this really mimics what we learned through the Far Northeast area planning process. So it seems that many of these issues are still in this order. So thanks for everyone for sharing and voting.
Looks like safety is still number 1 with 10 people who voted so far. Awesome. So I think most of you have filled this out. So the final results here you see are number 1 was safety. So that was the highest priority for everybody when it comes to these criteria topics. And then second place was transportation equity. Third was access to destinations. Fourth was climate change and resiliency. And fifth was growth pressure. Not to say that these all aren't super important. These are just kind of what people are prioritizing the most.
Awesome. Thank you, Katie.
Thank you all for voting.
Okay. So we're going to pause here for questions. And Katie, I'll let you run through this.
Yeah, so at the bottom of your screen, you should see a Q&A little symbol. You can either click that and type in your questions, or you could also, under participants, you have the option to raise your hand. So if you'd rather speak to the group, you can do that option as well. Otherwise, feel free to type in your questions. I think we could come up with some questions. Come on, guys. Guys and gals.
Either put you all to sleep or we explained things really well.
Does anyone have anything more to share about how they ranked those evaluation criteria? Maybe about why safety and transportation equity, you all ranked them so high?
It looks like we had a question come in through the chat. Has this committee coordinated with other city projects such as the 56th Avenue upgrade and others for our region?
Yes, thank you, Larry. That's a great question. And the answer is yes. We are closely coordinating with all the other ongoing projects in the area. So whether they're bond funded or some other way, we are making sure we're in step with them and understanding what they're working on. In addition, we are also making sure that we're aware of what developers are doing in the area and what they're planning, so we can make sure they're delivering the best thing for the community or the best products for the community as they build out some of the undeveloped areas of this area.
Awesome. Hope that answered your question, Ryan. It looks like we have a question from Matthew. Are there specific methods or thresholds used to determine transportation equity? For example, are any communities weighed for priority over others? That's a great question.
That is a great question. And Keith, do you have a more detailed answer for that?
I can take a shot at that. So the city uses a transportation equity index for the majority of the city and uses various pieces of data to attempt to put a score to where we should focus our investments. So some of those data points are things regarding health measures. So, things like the rate of obesity in an area, air pollution, I believe, is one of those measures, and those kinds of measures. Then we're also looking at lower income and majority minority areas. So those play into that as well. And the details of that equity index are actually outlined in the Blueprint Denver plan, which you can look up online if you want more details on the equity index. But that will also be available as we work through the Far Northeast Next Steps study plan, exactly how various projects get scored.
Yeah, thank you, Keith. And it looks like Dana also put a link to a map, and maybe it's is it an interactive map, Dana? Ooh, it is.
Yeah, it's an interactive map and it shows you a lot of sort of the data behind the map. I wanted to note that this one is it's from Denver Health. So there's just like very slight separate variables that they use than the Department of Transportation Infrastructure uses, but their map is a little more easy to read. So I linked that one and should give you a very good idea of what variables we look at.
Great question.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, well, if there are no more questions, I think we'll move on to our next topic. We're at about the time we promised, so that is great. Okay, so bikeway paving corridors. So I'm just going to walk us through kind of high level why we plan bikeways in the city and why we're coordinating with our repaving program within the Department of Transportation and Infrastructure. So at a high level, our goal is to move more people safely and efficiently and provide people more choice in how they get around our city. Next slide. This slide just lays out the mobility goals that we're looking at as we move throughout the city and plan projects. One goal to highlight is that we would ideally like 30% of all people commuting to work to be biking, walking, or taking transit by 2030. Next slide. Another really big goal is safety. So our goal is to have 0 traffic deaths and fatalities or serious injuries by 2030. And these graphics just show how people are injured and killed on our streets throughout the city. Next slide. Okay, so how do we achieve our commute and safety goals in the city? It has to do with our public right-of-way, which is what we call the street space where people drive and bike, the landscaped median where our trees are, and then the sidewalks. There are a lot of competing uses for these spaces, and it's also one of our largest and most important public space in the city of Denver. So how do we think about the space and potentially reallocate the space on our streets to improve safety, provide choice for folks, and encourage people to choose modes other than driving? Next slide. We have a number of plans that lay out how we want to achieve these goals. This is kind of a broad range of all these different plans, which lay out exactly how we should be doing this. And one plan to highlight in particular is Blueprint Denver, which lays out what we call bicycle priority streets. So those are all the streets where the community has said, hey, we'd like to put a bikeway. Speaking of the area plan that Eugene just talked about, the Far Northeast area plan, that also laid out in even more detail where the Far Northeast community wants to see bikeways. Next slide. So why provide safe and comfortable bikeways? Well, the majority of people in Denver are what we call interested but concerned. And that means they're interested in biking on our streets, but concerned about the safety or being able to go where they need to. And only 16% actually currently regularly feel comfortable riding a bike in Denver today. Next slide. So if we add up those people who are confident already and then interested but concerned, we have 75% of people in Denver who would consider riding a bike in Denver if they had more comfortable facilities. Okay, So how do we build improvements to any of our streets, and in particular bikeway improvements? Well, we have a lot of different programs and a lot of different buckets of money where programs and improvements get made. So we've got a program that fills sidewalk gaps. We've got our Safe Routes to School program, which improves conditions in, near and around schools for people walking and biking. We've got a program that just upgrades signals. And then in the upper left-hand corner is we have a paving program. Next slide. And the paving program typically repaves about 400 to 500 miles of roadway every year. And this is a great opportunity for us to look at those bikeway priority streets that I talked about earlier and say, can we install bikeways along with our repaving program, since we're already going to the street and touching it and making changes anyway. Next slide. So these three projects, North Dallas Street, East 51st Ave, and East 53rd Ave, are all projects in the Northeast area that are paving projects. So they're getting repaved this year, and they overlap with our bikeway proposed. This is where we want a bikeway map. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to pass it over to Riley Lemie to talk about North Dallas Street.
All right, thanks, Paige, and hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. My name is Riley Lemie, and I am a transportation planner with Denver's Dottie. And the first project that I'm going to talk to you tonight is the one that Paige just mentioned at first, which is North Dallas Street from East 51st to East 56th. So if you go to the next slide, I'll show you a map of what that project looks like. So again, as I just mentioned, we're looking at Dallas Street between East 51st, or also East Prairie Meadows Drive to the south, and then up to East 56th. And what's proposed there is a buffered bike lane, and I'll talk about what that might look like in just a minute. You can go to the next slide. So as we're talking about connecting our different bikeways in the city, Paige just mentioned some of the plans that were and bikeways that were identified through past planning efforts. One of the goals of the bike projects that we build are to connect into that larger network of bikeways. So you'll notice on my screen, I'm showing a dashed line on East 51st and a dashed line on East 56th, with the goal of building a bikeway that would connect into those bikeways. So that way you are creating a network of roads that are safe and easy to get around by bicycle. So what we're here to talk about for this particular one is Dallas, again, because this particular street is being repaved this year, and that's providing the opportunity to install that bike lane that was identified from past planning efforts. Another benefit of this particular segment is that it would also connect the park, or the Northfield Athletic Complex that you can see that's to the right on my screen. So just wanted to mention that as well. Next slide, please. So today, this picture that you can see on the screen kind of shows what the street looks like today. So you'll notice that on the west side of the street, there's undeveloped land, and then there's some industrial uses on the east side of the street. There is currently no dedicated space for bicyclists. And so we have a wide street that has 2 travel lanes. And then you can use the lane currently for parking as well. And again, this is just what exists today. Next slide. So one of the things that we look at before we design any project is we take a look to assess the existing conditions. So we'll look at things like volumes, how fast people are going, how many vehicles are traveling on the street, and we'll look at if there's been any crashes to determine if there are locations where there are safety issues. On this street, what we pulled from our past crash information is that there's been 16 vehicle crashes along the corridor, and that's from 2015 to 2020. So as Paige mentioned earlier, one of our goals when we do these projects is to improve safety. And so we always look to see before we start any project where those past safety issues may exist. Next slide. So as I mentioned earlier, what was identified both through the past planning efforts is a buffered bike lane on the street. And so a buffered bike lane, you can see what in the picture that I'm showing on my screen, you can see what that looks like. It's basically a dedicated space for someone riding a bike. And then there is a buffer that provides space between the person riding a bike and either parked cars or moving traffic. And so by providing that buffer, that's a goal of being able to provide a little bit more space between a person that's on their bike and someone that's in a moving vehicle. So that's what that buffer is for. And again, that's what's being proposed on this particular street. Next slide. So what is, as I mentioned before, currently there are land uses on either side. The land uses on either side are undeveloped on one, and then on the other, you have some industrial uses. What's currently proposed is to potentially remove one or both sides of the parking lane on this street in order to be able to accommodate the buffered bike lane. As I mentioned before, because of the undeveloped land uses and the industrial uses on the other side, there are no businesses or residents that directly front this particular street. So just wanted to add that part of this in. And that is what's currently being proposed. This design has not started yet. So we are still doing our homework and doing our research on this. But one of the things that we want to hear from you, of course, is are there things that we should be considering as we design this project and as we move it, as we advance the design. Next slide. So that's all that I have for that project. I'm going to hand it back over to you, Paige, so that you can talk about East 51st.
Excellent. Thank you, Riley. And just an FYI, we have a survey that we'll be sending the link to. Actually, if someone could put that in the chat as well, but that'll give you all the opportunity to provide a little bit more feedback about all these designs that we're showing you today. So East 51st Ave from Central Park Boulevard to Havana Street. As we have mentioned, this is a repaving project and also lines up with our proposed bikeway network. Next slide. So this proposed bikeway extends from Central Park Boulevard to Havana Street. And the intent is to connect the new buffered bike lane that was actually just installed last year on East 51st Ave to the east of Havana to the bike lanes that exist starting at Dallas and going west. And then also again connects to the Northfield Athletic Complex and bike lanes that exist on Central Park Boulevard as well. We've also got a couple gnarly intersections, just larger intersections in this area that we'd like to improve with this project. So we've got Central Park Boulevard, Dallas, and Havana are all bigger intersections and or carry some freight turning movements that we'd like to address. Next slide. So what does the street look like today? We've got an existing bike lane from Central Park Boulevard to Dallas Street, and the speed limit is currently 30 miles per hour. We've also got a travel lane in each direction and then parking on either side. Next slide. Then from Dallas to Havana, we've got pretty wide travel lanes and parking lanes. And we've also got some freight trucks that park and or are stored here as well. Next slide. Okay, so we took a look at how many vehicles travel along the corridor in any given day. And we figured out that that is about 4,500 vehicles per day, which is about normal for a street this size. I mean, relatively average, we would say. And the chart at the corner left shows essentially how we make decisions about what type of bikeway to install on a street. So we take a look at speeds and we take a look at vehicle volumes. So that red dot there shows about 4,500 of volume or vehicles per day, and then 30 miles per hour, which is the speed limit. And it shows us that we'd probably like a bike lane, if possible, a buffered bike lane along this corridor, so people feel the safest, and it is actually safe for people bicycling. Next slide. Okay, so parking is something we look at whenever we're installing a bikeway project that might impact parking. As you can see, we've kind of got a variety of parking occupancy, or who's there at what time of day. We looked at 5 a.m. on a weekday, which tells us about overnight parking. We looked at weekend mornings, and then we looked at a weekday midday. And what we found is about 80% of all parking spaces are available really at any time of the day that we looked at it. So we would say this is a pretty low parked corridor, but there are certain areas where people park more frequently. Next slide. So as I mentioned, our data shows us a bike lane, if possible, a buffered bike lane would be preferred on this corridor. As you know, there are bike lanes existing from Central Park Boulevard to Dallas already. So we are looking at possibly upgrading those to buffered bike lane, but we want to hear from you to see what your experience is on those existing bike lanes. And then from Dallas to Havana, we would recommend installing a buffered bike lane. And that's especially because of the freight traffic there, and just we want to provide more space for people biking and space between big trucks and people biking. Okay. So switching gears a little to a different project. That's a lot of information. We're now moving to the Gateway neighborhood, just east of Montebello. Next slide. So East 53rd Ave, between Chambers and about Memphis, is what we're looking at. This is, again, a repaving corridor. Next slide. The intent is to connect kind of all the trails on the east side, and then the proposed trail even farther east that hasn't actually been developed out yet, to the shared sidewalks along Chambers Road, and then eventual bikeway along 53rd Ave to the west of Chambers. And then, of course, we've got connections to Parkfield Lake Park and the kind of school complex right next to Kittredge. Next slide. So what does the street look like today? Between Chambers and Idalia, we've got a median, travel and parking lanes on either side. It's a really wide stretch. There isn't a ton that is on either side, just the backs of some houses and the park. Next slide. From Idalia to Memphis, we have two pretty wide travel lanes and then parking areas on either side. Next slide. Thank you. So we, as Riley mentioned, we take a look at the crash data along every corridor, and the orange dots show us where we've seen crashes involving bicyclists or pedestrians, which definitely raises a red flag for us in terms of where we might want to focus our attention and make sure we improve. In general, we've had 41 vehicle crashes along the corridor in the past 5 years, which is, it's quite a relatively high for a corridor this size. might be explained by the crossing with Chambers, which is a big street. And when arterials like that intersect any street, crossings become more difficult and we see more crashes. Next slide. So speed and volume. Speed limit is 25. We see an average speed of 25, which is great. Good job, everyone. Our average daily traffic is 1,300 cars per day, which is pretty typical for a local street like this. Next slide. We also took a look at who's parking along the corridor. We know that the school complex faculty and staff use 53rd Ave to park during the school day. We weren't able to collect that data due to COVID and school not totally being in session. But we did collect 5 a.m. data, so that tells us about overnight parking. And what we found is mostly people park, if they are parking overnight, just to the west of Memphis, but otherwise there's very little parking along that corridor overnight. We've got 86% of parking spots were available when we took a look at that 5 a.m. count. That was last week. Okay. So based on those speeds and volumes, we are proposing adding a striped bike lane, and the implications of that would be removing parking on one side of the street. Now, we definitely want to hear from you about your experience along the road, where you do park at maybe non-overnight hours, really everything to do with the street that you experience as a resident. So this isn't set in stone, but this is what we're looking at right now. Next slide. Okay, we're on to Q&A session. So feel free to click the Q&A button and type in your comment or question. And then we've also got, remember, a set of surveys that we'll send out to you. Someone may have already put it in the chat, and that is a great way to share your experience on those 3 streets that we already talked about.
Great, thank you, Paige. We do have some good questions in so far. We're catching them on both the chat and the Q&A, so feel free to put them on either. And the first question was from Maggie, and it was about kind of buffer bicycle facility protection. It mentions North Broadway at Alameda. There's a buffered bike lane that has a physical barrier. And she notes, I know these add additional costs, but is it possible to include that element on these? So I think maybe Paige, it would apply to either of the 2 we're looking at buffers on, but maybe Paige, you can cover that.
Yeah, definitely. So the reason we don't add the physical barriers along all bikeways, it's partially because of cost. As you astutely mentioned in your comments, and then also how we're able to put those in the ground. And maybe I'll call on Bryce or one of our build folks to kind of detail out a little bit more what that looks like and maybe why that isn't something we consider for every bikeway.
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, for one, protected bike lanes take more coordination within different city departments, like maintenance wise. So there's more coordination with that, and we basically want to install the protected bike lanes where we feel they are warranted to kind of ease costs and maintenance issues and coordination. So that being said, Paige had the bike selection chart up on a previous slide. So that's kind of how we make that determination, just so we don't have protected bike lanes all over the city.
Great, Thanks. And I would also add on that one that parking, if you have a buffered bike lane and want to add protection where there is parking, it impacts sight distance at intersections. So you have to do more intersection adjustments with protected bike lanes versus buffered. Then next, there's another question here about timing, about a timing issue. And Dana, I'm going to let you take this one. So there's a timing issue with the traffic lights at Chambers and 53rd. The issue, in my opinion, is the left turning of vehicles coming from 53rd. Dana?
Yeah, thanks, Alicia. Larry, if you want to expand on what you think that timing issue, I'm happy to have you unmute yourself and talk through it. What I would add is that we just completed a road safety audit for Chambers, and they are looking at the timing of all of the signals along the northern section of Chambers. So this is a good time to reevaluate the timing, but it'd be good to better understand what you believe the issue is. It sounds like maybe there's a delay for left turning vehicles. Is that what you're speaking about? And you can write that in the chat too, if you prefer.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
I'm a member of the Montbello Golden Age Club, and I live on Montbello. And before the pandemic hit, we met Tuesdays and Thursdays at the rec center. And it was always an issue after either coming from the rec center or going to the rec center, going through that interchange, the dodging of people trying to make left-hand turns either way at that intersection. And in some cases, I think the lights are, the length of them are pretty long. That makes some folks a little bit impatient. So they'll try to make that left-hand turn when they probably should wait. But I think that, and I could be wrong, like I said, it's been a long time since I've been over there, since we haven't been through that since the pandemic. But I was hoping that they'd put a discrete left-hand signal on the traffic lights, which would provide those folks making left-hand turns the ample time to do it without worrying about traffic coming from the other side. So I don't know if that's been corrected or been looked at or not, but I know that that was definitely a problem while we were using that facility.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you for clarifying that. If you haven't already, Larry, can you submit that as a 311? Our left turn signal where there's an actual bulb up there, it does require a little study to see if it is warranted. But if there are issues for people either trying to run through at unsafe locations or unsafe moments, you know, with too much traffic coming through, it's definitely something we want to evaluate. So if you could submit that as 311, it'll get in the queue requesting a left turn signal at that intersection. I'll follow up on it as well, but it's good to have it in the 311 for us.
All right, I can do that. But let me ask you a quick question. Am I still on?
You are.
Yeah, you had evaluated the number of accidents that you were having in that corridor. I suspect the highest percentage of those accidents were at 53rd and Chambers. Am I right?
I will try and bring up that safety audit quickly to know, but it's not in my head at the moment.
All right.
Yeah, unless Evan.
I'll go ahead and confirm it, but
has
let's
more
move
info.
on. Thanks, Larry.
Okay. And I think maybe one more question, and then I know we need to move on to the next segment. And Paige, this is a question that folks may appreciate, even though I haven't seen it asked here. Can you, you or Riley, I guess, maybe Riley will pull you in since you haven't answered one yet, discuss the difference between a bikeway and a bike lane. We keep talking about bikeways, and then we talk about these pictures with bike lanes.
Yeah, I'm happy to take that question. So there are a lot of different things that we call a bikeway, and there's kind of a whole spectrum that we use, and how we determine what type of bikeway it is oftentimes, again, based on the speed of the roadway or the how much traffic is on the roadway. So some of the different types of bikeways are a bike lane is kind of is one, which just means that we put paint on the roadway that indicates a special space for a bikeway or for people riding bikes. We also have a buffered bike lane, and a buffered bike lane is what I described earlier, where it's dedicated space, but with some sort of painted buffer between people riding bikes and between people driving. And then the third that we also use is something that's called a protected bike lane. And that basically just means a physical barrier between that's basically inside of that buffer. And again, sometimes we use those and sometimes we don't. It depends on the volume and the amount of traffic. And if we, through our study, if we find out that there's a lot of traffic or a high volume or the speeds are high, we will then go ahead and protect that. And then another fourth type of bikeway is something that looks a lot different from all of those that I just described, and that's called a neighborhood bikeway. And neighborhood bikeways are on streets that are low volume, where there's not a lot of traffic, but the speeds are pretty low. And generally, it's not a dedicated space. It's actually shared spaces where we would kind of focus improvements on the intersections to help people be able to more safely navigate the street as both a bicyclist and a pedestrian. And so again, there's a lot of different bikeways, but it's mainly any improvement that makes a street more suitable for riding a bike is a bikeway. And that can also mean a trail too, or a shared use sidewalk. So a lot of different types.
Great, thank you, Riley. Given I don't see any others, and I think it is time to switch over to our next topic. So Paige, is that you? Oh, that's right. I forgot we have the plans to projects this one.
I did too. This is a good reminder. Thank you. Yeah, so real quick, just going to cover the timeline of these bike paving projects. So right now we're in the March Educate and Understand meeting. So telling you what we heard or what we've evaluated on the streets, and then hearing from you about your experiences along the streets. In May, we're going to come back to you all and talk about, based on all of that information we collected from you and our data collection, what our proposed design is for that street. And then in late spring, we will be wrapping up the design. And then starting this summer, we'll actually be installing these projects. So they're pretty quick turnaround. Now's the time to give us your feedback. Next slide. Okay, I just wanted to briefly cover the Montbello Safer Streets, which was a series of bikeway planning projects that happened last year. So these are all, the designs are done, we're just waiting for them to be installed. And I just wanted to walk through really briefly when we have those planned so you are all aware. So the first project is Andrews Drive from Peoria to Crown. We're still working out a timeline for that one, so to be determined. The second corridor is Gateway Ave, 51st Ave from Uvalde to Chambers. We're planning to install that later this year. We say late 2021, so that'll probably be in the fall or early winter. Our third project on here is Uvalde from 51st to 56th, and that is a 2022 project. It's being coordinated with our repaving program. So that street will be repaved at the same time as that is installed. And then our fourth street is Crown Boulevard. We will be installing that bike lane from Albrecht to 56th Ave sometime this year. It is not yet determined exactly when. And I should have mentioned as a reminder, so the Andrews corridor, that'll be removing a travel lane from each side, installing a protected bike lane. The Gateway and 51st Ave project is removing the parking lane and installing a protected bike lane on either side. And then Uvalde, as it stands now, we'll be removing a travel lane in each direction and then adding parking protected bike lane. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's that survey link that I was talking about, and we'll put that in the chat as well. But you can take the survey about the Dallas 51st and 53rd Ave projects. You can also visit our project website at bit.ly/bike Denver bike paving. I'm sorry, the survey link is bit.ly/NE Denver survey. And then we've also got office hours with the project team if you want to have a more in-depth chat with any of us. And those links are below. And I think Dana will put them in the chat. Okay. I think that wraps up our bike paving corridors. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm passing it off to Keith here.
Thank you, Paige. Okay, so our last section here for tonight's meeting is a quick discussion of the open channel streets. These are the streets that have drainage facilities generally down the center of the street, mostly within the Montbello neighborhood and the industrial neighborhood just to the west. I am going to ask Teresa Patterson with the Mile High Flood District to give us a quick update on a study that is ongoing to evaluate the capacity of those drainage facilities and potential improvements to better convey stormwater. So Teresa?
Thanks, Keith.
Sure.
So the Mile High Flood District partnered with Denver, and there's a small portion of the area, which is also in Aurora, to look at the conveyance system through the Montbello neighborhood. And one of the goals out of that study is to identify potential flooding issues that are going on, look at opportunities to improve the flooding and alleviate some of it, and then also to look at the long-term maintenance needs of the system. Can you go to the next slide, please? So to give you an idea of specifically what we're talking about is that many of the streets through the Montbello neighborhood have medians that are used to convey flood flows during high rainfall events. And all of them have some combination of a concrete lined channel and some sort of vegetated space adjacent to that in some form, and they're very different. These types of systems are really, really high maintenance. And so one of the things that we're looking at with this study are opportunities to replace those systems with something that functions better than what is there, but is less maintenance. And the exciting part of that is that we're looking at these as great opportunities to give this space back to the community. Right now, they're designed as they do one thing, and they set, year round and are only really utilized when it rains, and particularly during high rainfall events is when they're fully realized their potential. And so what a great opportunity to look at the system, look at the streets. What can we give back to the community to be used all the time instead of just when it's raining? And so that's really the cornerstone of this study and what we're trying to accomplish with that. And so I'm really excited that this also multimodal study is happening at the same time. So thank you, Keith.
Thanks, Teresa. Christina, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. So just to put this in context, we have several streets within the Montbello neighborhood that currently have these open drainage channels. Most of those streets have 2 travel lanes on either side. So as Teresa was saying, it is a really good opportunity, and it's a nice bit of coordination here within the city to coordinate the drainage study with the far northeast next steps study that Paige summarized earlier. The far northeast next steps study is going to take a look at mobility improvements that can be combined potentially with some of the drainage improvement projects. And generally those improvements will focus on some of the same themes that we just talked about with the bike paving projects, which are, how much volume are those streets carrying? What are the speeds along those streets, crashes, etc., and propose alternative uses for the paved space and maybe even complete street redesigns. So I just wanted to, in the next few slides, present some options that may be considered. By no means are these options final or something that has been decided. This is all part of the upcoming work over the next several months. So this is just a schematic of what's out there today. Again, a concrete channel running down the middle of the street. Next slide, please. So one relatively straightforward and simple option would be to just expand that channel a little bit and provide additional landscaping along the sides of the existing channel. This would basically be the status quo on the street itself, still maintaining the 2 travel lanes and parking on either side. Next slide. Another option would be to still expand that channel, but remove all the concrete and make it a more naturalized channel. This schematic, I have to say, is actually a couple of years old, and the current thinking, I believe, on the drainage side is that it might not look exactly as what's shown here, but the idea is the same, that it would be a more naturalized area. Again, status quo on the street itself. Next slide. Okay, this option builds upon that more naturalized channel and would add a bicycle facility. The bicycle facility shown here is on the inside, center running. It's the green stripes. And it may also include some kind of pedestrian walkway along the center. So this starts to look more like a parkway facility that has a nice amenity in the middle of the street. The trade-off, of course, is that in this situation, we would potentially lose a travel lane for vehicular traffic. Now, most of these streets can accommodate such a change because the volumes are lower than what we would consider a threshold for needing 2 lanes in each direction. And the final option is a little bit more of a kind of total reimagination of the street and the channel system. This option would move all traffic to one side of the channel. So you would have 2 direct or bidirectional traffic flowing in both directions on one side. And you may provide parking on that side. Or you could accommodate turn lanes if the need is there. And on the other side, you would return that to potentially a bike facility or a trail connection or some other reimagining that starts to look more like a linear park kind of treatment adjacent to the stormwater facility. Now this, like I said, those are 4 options that don't necessarily encapsulate every single option. Teresa and I were coordinating today on this presentation, and she mentioned another potential option. Teresa, do you want to try to describe that to the group here?
Yeah, and again, I want to caveat this that we haven't looked at this in great detail. This is just an idea. But the other option may be that the size of the channel that's visible would be a lot smaller and would potentially take up a lot more space. And then we would pull off the larger flows into an underground system, and still be able to convey as much, if not more, than we can today in the same system, in a similar space.
Right.
So you'd see a small channel above ground, and then there would be a large pipe below the street section potentially.
Thanks. And, you know, I think as your study and as the Far Northeast Next Step study progress, we will further develop these options into concepts to be presented again to stakeholders and the public for feedback. But I would like to hear what folks are thinking of, you know, some of the various mobility options that are presented here. I know it's a little early in the stormwater project and study to necessarily zero in on a defined alternative or needs. So just from the mobility standpoint, I'd like to hear some feedback, or I know I do see maybe we have a couple questions too. So I think that's that. And I think we could look for questions now. Oh, okay. I'm seeing one.
Yes, we have one question from Larry. And Larry, do you want to unmute and expand on this question a little bit?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I wondered, have you guys seen lately the view there on Gateway from Chambers to the high school? Have you actually walked that area?
I'm sorry, Larry, the view from where?
If you're coming from Green Valley Ranch, going west on Green Valley Ranch Boulevard, it changes to Gateway, if I'm not mistaken, and it goes all the way down to the high school, 51st. Familiar with that area?
Yep.
Right now, that's really, really nice. There's been work on two intersections where they've actually made little mini parks, but it also acts as a reservoir for overflow. You know, I thought it was great. I surely would hate to see that change per se, but that definitely falls in the qualification of what you're talking about, the 2-lane traffic on both sides and making changes and what have you. I don't see why you would change that right now anyway. Does that make sense to anybody else? And I'll shut up.
Yes, that makes sense to me, Larry. And I think that's the kind of feedback that we're looking for is what have you seen that's changed recently that you like or that you don't like? So hearing that kind of feedback, definitely we would like to incorporate that kind of perception into where both of these projects are headed. And Teresa, I don't know if you want to expand on the need for detention or retention at all beyond just conveyance.
Yeah, we have looked at opportunities throughout, but unfortunately, there's not a lot of space to do additional reduction in the flows with, you know, large storage spaces for to store stormwater temporarily. It's something that we did look at during the alternatives analysis, but I don't think that any of them really struck out as being beneficial and very effective. That is the one thing we want to make sure that they're effective. Otherwise, it's not worth the effort of the construction and the disruption to everybody. I will like to add though that you know, the next piece that we're working on is the Uvalde corridor from Maxwell up to 56th and then north of 56th into the Rocky Mountain Arsenal. We've secured a consultant and we're going to be looking in more depth at the conceptual design on that in the next few months. And we will have fleshed out some more ideas and opportunities of how we can really look at this area as a system to improve safety, to improve it as an amenity. And I'm super excited about that. So look forward to seeing more on that.
The Uvalde corridor is one of the corridors that Paige mentioned that has been identified as one of the bike repaving projects. So that is a good example of the city's approach to a one build kind of approach to projects, where the coordination between those teams to come up with a design that serves not only the stormwater project, but also the bicycle facility project as well. Okay, and I think I don't see any other questions in the chat, so I do want to, I think we're going to turn it back over to Paige for a wrap up.
Sure. Yeah, happy to. Okay, well, first of all, thank you all for being here. We appreciate you listening and participating. We have a couple ways to get a hold of us. The main way is you can visit our website. It's bit.ly/FAR NE next steps. And that website will take you to details about all of the projects that we discussed tonight and has more information about the Far Northeast Next Step study. So that's a good repository for all of this information if you're interested in looking more or sharing with your neighbors or other members of the community. There also are some more information about each of these projects, who you can contact, what email you can reach out to reach us if you have additional questions. And then we also have a hotline for the Far Northeast Next Step study if anyone would prefer to call, and we can give you a call back. All right. Looks like Dana stuck that in the chat as well. Yeah, we've got the link in the chat as well as some of those emails. So feel free to reach out to any of those and visit our website. And just want to thank everyone for attending, and thanks to the project team for coordinating this. I hope everyone has a great night.
Thanks, everyone.